Available now from MVD Visual on a package. It's actually a Blu-ray, a DVD, and a soundtrack CD altogether, is Street Survivors, the true story of the Lynyrd Skynyrd plane crash. This is a drama, docudrama. I never know how to qualify docudrama. Basically, this is the story of the plane crash that wound up claiming the lives of a few members of the band and their crew back in 1977. I was a fan of Lynyrd Skynyrd since I was in high school. This would have been the early 90s. I stumbled across an old music video and I'm like, wow, Sweet Home Alabama is a pretty good song. Let me pursue that a little bit more. And I bought all the albums and I got not deeply into Skynyrd, but I had a good appreciation of the music. And years later, I had seen the Behind the Music that VH1 did, and they mentioned the plane crash. They got into it a little bit, but it was never anything I knew a lot about, beyond that it basically stopped the band in its tracks and took out some members of the group. So this film is hosted by, or narrated by, Artemis Pyle, who is the drummer for Skynyrd and one of the survivors of the plane crash. Hard to have the narrator not be one of the survivors of the plane crash, I suppose. And he basically sets the stage, and you get this dramatized version of what led up to that happening, and then a pretty in-depth recounting of the incident itself and the immediate aftermath. I don't know how much this film will mean to people who are not fans of the band already, who don't know who the players are already. Me going in, knowing the names, knowing what everybody looked like, knowing the music, knowing a little bit about some of the personalities helped quite a bit. You don't really get a history of the band. You really see the band for, I want to say, here and there, maybe a year or less leading up to when the plane crash happens. You see Pyle joining the band, and then you just are sort of spending time with them on the road, and mostly like in hotel rooms and a little bit on stage. Really in the weeks or so leading up to when this happened back in October of '77. Pluses and minuses. Overall, I liked this. It really kind of does feel like a feature-length reenactment, meaning this feels like they shot a ton of footage for flashbacks or reenactments while somebody is telling the tale of what happened at the very end of the band, all strung together. So the performances are fine, but they're very kind of low-key. The dialogue is nothing really to write home about. It really gives you a feel for the relationship between Artemis Pyle and Ronnie Van Zant to a degree, the singer of the band. But even then, Van Zant seems sort of like, you don't really get a good sense of who he was or what he was like. He kind of comes off as not a great guy for the most part in this film. But it doesn't give you the history of the band. You don't really hear any music in this film. This is one of those films where they focus on the people in the behind the scenes. You see them on stage a couple of times very briefly, but they really, I don't think they could get the rights to the Skynyrd music. So I think you hear a cover of one Skynyrd song, and the rest of the music in this film is either just instrumental music sort of in their style, like a bluesy southern rock, or it's songs that bring to mind Skynyrd that are done by somebody else, that just sort of give you a vibe for the era. Now, I will say they nail the look of the band really, really well. A lot of films, and this is where, going back and forth, if this was like a major Hollywood production, I think you would have had more of a sense of their story. The characters would have been more fleshed out. It would have been a bit more, it would have drawn you into the story of the band and these guys a little bit more. That would have made the tragedy feel all that much more horrible when it happened. But what you get on the upside is, if it was a major Hollywood film, it would have starred people you know, and they wouldn't necessarily have looked like the guys in the band. They probably would have all been wearing fake hair and facial hair and wigs, which is something that always yanks me out of a period piece, when somebody clearly has a beard that was just stuck on. These people, it sounds such a bizarre things to say, but I liked this because the beards were real. Artemis, the guy playing Artemis Pyle, looked a lot like he did back then. Most of the guys in the band, I could identify who they were supposed to be from the album covers because they really nailed the look and the clothes really well. Again, acting here and there, recreation of the era, pretty good, but at the same time, it kind of had that vibe that a lot of stuff does, where everybody looks like they were just handed these clothes off the rack. Like, everybody looked a little too clean. I'm not saying the people in Skynyrd didn't bathe. I'm just saying, in the instance of this movie, a lot of stuff looked really, really clean. It didn't look lived in so much. But it does nail the feel of the era pretty well, and the music, and then just the overall vibe of what was going on. Most of what you get really are the band hanging out backstage with groupies, cavorting, getting loaded, breaking things, and yelling here and there. There's not a lot, again, of story to this film, but it's very effective in giving you the sense of dread. You know where the story's going to go. The movie opens telling you where it's going to go. The title of the movie tells you there's a plane crash coming. So when you first see the plane and you see these little warning signs, you're just like, oh, don't get on the plane. Just it's like when you watch La Bamba or the Buddy Holly story, and it gets closer and closer to where you know it's going, and you're just like, well, maybe they won't do this. Maybe they'll take a bus instead. So when it gets to the point where the plane crash happens, it's done in excruciating detail. And you see a couple of trips they took on this plane, or one trip they took on this plane beforehand, where you think that's going to be when it crashes. And it gives you this sense of dread, and like, oh man, somebody should have known better. Somebody should have done something, but it didn't. So I enjoyed the film, but again, I think I really brought a lot to it myself. So I think if you were some 20-something, if you're somebody who didn't know who Lynyrd Skynyrd was, you'd be I don't know that it would make as much of an impact. Other than once things start going wrong on the plane, it's very riveting and compelling, because it puts you right there with these people, and it's scary and unpleasant. And the fact that anybody survived it is amazing. And in the tale of, sort of how Artemis Pyle, which I guess is pretty accurately conveyed from what I've read, how he survived and got to safety and brought people back to rescue who was left, is borderline amusing. And at one point, it sort of does go for a laugh, which I thought was kind of in poor taste, but it's apparently what really happened. And Artemis Pyle wrote the story that this movie was based on and signed off on this film. So apparently it's cool with him. So if it's cool with the guy who lived through it, I guess it's kind of cool with me. So this film is out now. This was released in 2020, and that's the year we're still currently in. And it was released on video in June, and it is the Blu-ray, the DVD with the same contents, and then the CD of all the music in the film, which I think is a 12-track CD. So if you like the film, if you like Skynyrd, it's certainly worth a look if you like Skynyrd, and it is available now. Street Survivors, the true story of the Lynyrd Skynyrd plane crash.